Hey everybody, welcome to another Design with Jo video. I'm Joanne Rogers, a Stampin' Up! Demonstrator in Central Alberta, Canada, and I've been designing with you in mind since 1999. So today I've got some tips and tricks on working with the Big Shot. So there's different cutting platforms that we have, how to keep your plates from warping a little bit. I was doing a Facebook Live not that long ago, and I had a question on from somebody just asking, how do I keep my plates from warping? And so I thought, well, if somebody's asking, that it might be a good idea for me to put something out there. I have a few different ideas that might work for you because not everything works the same for everybody else. And I do also want to tell you a little bit about the difference between open dies and detailed dies and what might work for cutting. So one of the first things I am going to talk about is warping. So the warping that I'm talking about is the warping that happens with your cutting plates. And especially now that Stampin' Up! No longer carries the cutting pads or will no longer carry the Big Shot in just a couple months, I thought it might be useful for you to have some clear ideas on how I keep mine from warping. So they are a little bit warped here, but these have been used hundreds and hundreds of times. I do lots of in-person classes, and I'm not always right there with everybody who's cutting. So even though I'd love to say that I always keep a bottom one or a top one clear, it just doesn't happen because people flip and do things differently. And that's okay. That's fine. I usually try and impart as much as I can, but sometimes you just can't catch. So what I have done is I've written on here bottom, since it was not clean when I first did that. It wasn't straight out of the package. But what happens is I try and keep the same one on the bottom as much as possible. And when I do, I turn this over a few times. So you can't probably tell through the screen right there, but when I turn that one over, you can see that it actually is a little bit higher on the edges than it is in the middle. And when it's like that, I try not to cut with it, because what it's doing, and when I run it through the Big Shot and through the roller that's right here, that's just going to increase the edges, actually the bow in the middle and the edges lifting up even more. So when it's looking like this, I will turn it and I will use it this way. I don't flip it every single time, especially if it has this in the middle, because what I find that what I'm trying to do now is get it a little bit back into shape. I've almost predominantly started working with my Big Shot platform as of about a year ago. I do still use my magnetic platform, although I don't use it nearly as much. I find that my Big Shot platform stays on my Big Shot all the time, because when you're transferring back and forth with embossing folders, you have to really, I had to really think, you might be better at it than I am, but I had to really think about what does my sandwich need to be for my embossing folders. So the one thing I do is I keep a set of plates for my embossing only, and I keep a set of plates for cutting. And I think it just reduces the amount of times that it's going through that roller on the Big Shot. So you can see here that my embossing plates, and these ones also have been in for about a year, have really, and I do a fair bit of embossing, but not quite as much as I do cutting, are really, really flat. This is a big piece of acrylic plastic. It's really quite solid, and I usually have my thin die adapter on the bottom, so because it's not as thick. So if by chance it does get cut into, there's this gets cut into rather, there's less chance that I'm going to do damage to this thin one. So I try and put that always on the bottom, and then I'm going to put my bottom one here, the one I've written bottom on, which is usually my flattest one, and then I'll put my framelits over top. The other thing that I don't do very much anymore at all is I do not use my precision base plate. So the precision base plate is a plate that is a really, really solid piece of metal. I will use it on dies where I've already tried them with my Big Shot platform and my thin die adapter, and they're not giving me a very precise cut. If it's not giving me a really precise cut after going through a couple times, then to save myself a little bit of frustration, I will pull this out. But I do find that when I use this platform, I get a lot more curving of my standard cutting pads. And so I only use this as a last resort. So what I do is I do, for the most part, tend to cut into my bottom plate. I don't tend to use my dies upside down, but that I've heard is another option. So if that seems reasonable for you, go ahead and do it. I know that for some folks, that's a great tip. For me, I tend to cut down because then I can always see what I'm cutting. So it's not quite so important on these detailed dies when there's no stamping, but when I have stamped something and I want to cut around it, it's much more difficult for me to do that when I cannot see my image. Now I can put some washi tape on there in order to hold it in place, but I find that I just like to be able to see. So that's a personal preference for me, and it might work for you. So these are examples of the seasonal layers detailed dies, and when I say that they cut out an image all by themselves, you can use this as a standalone image, where generally if you were to cut out an open die like this, you would need to have it stamped on the inside, unless it were sort of a shape like a circle or a triangle or a diamond or something like that. So that's what I mean when I say detailed dies, and the work is all done for you, and these are fabulous dies. I use these a lot in my creating. When I'm cutting my detailed dies, I may need to run them through a couple times, but it's the exact same sandwich where I have my thin die adapter on the bottom, I have my Big Shot platform, I have my bottom plate, my paper, my die, and then my top plate. And I run that through. And then with my detailed dies, I always check to make sure that I have it cut out. And so on this one here, I do. And I pull in my Big Shot die brush, and I keep my foam part of my Big Shot die brush in a little box. This is just a box from some golf balls. And whoops, I'm going to pull that out of there now. I'm going to try and leave it in. And I use it with the metal part facing up, and I run my die brush over top. And sometimes the die will just come off like that. And sometimes I don't try and do this too often because I find that it actually shapes my die. Instead, I will pull in my pokey tool and I will quickly go over these. And I find with dots like this, if you just sort of run it over top, you can usually get them out fairly easily. So that's one little tip. Always have your pokey tool with you. Your paper piercing tool or your take your pick tool works as well. Here's another tip I have for you working with open dies. So I have stamped my image there and I have my open die. I take a piece of washi tape that I have either put on to my clothing and picked up a little bit of lint because I don't want it to be super sticky. And because when it's super sticky, it can lift up some of the paper. Now, when you're cutting out and you're going to use this on something, it doesn't matter quite so much. But if I can get another use out of this paper a little bit later without having one layer, the top layer removed, I think that's quite a bit better. So I'm going to run this through, and I'm going to do this the same. Whoops, I'm working on my top one. So I'm going to run this through, and the same way that I have. And the little sort of snap crackle pops that you hear, they're just fine. So I'm going to pull that off, and then you've got your car. So that one worked just fine going through there because it's not hugely open in here. When you have a die that has a bigger area inside, and this is not the largest you can have, there are lots of framelits where they have a bigger area than this. But here's a couple tips for that. When the roller, there's a roller inside your Big Shot, and when it rolls over top of something, a die, what it does is it exerts pressure on it. And there's quite a bit of pressure actually. I don't even know how many pounds of pressure, but a lot. You certainly wouldn't want to have your fingers in there. And when you're rolling this through, if I were to roll this through, it's going to put more pressure here, and this is not yet going to be in the roller. So when it does that, it could have a tendency to bend your die just a little bit. So when I have an open die like this, I tend to have it run the same way as the words on my Big Shot, or I will also run it through just a little bit on a diagonal, and a little bit on the diagonal seems to make a great cut. So then I just put this through and run that through. If I were cutting this out and wanting it to be in an exact same spot, I would also use a piece of washi tape for that. Okay, I think that those are probably all the tips and tricks that I have for you today. I hope that you found these tips useful and that you will consider using them when you are doing your big shot cutting and embossing. I'd love it if you checked out my blog. I post regularly over there, and I'm usually a pretty big tipper in my posts too. So I like to give you lots of ideas on how I've made my own crafting a little bit easier. So hop on over there at www.designwithjo.ca. I'd love to have you join in and make some comments. And I also have a Facebook group called Design with Jo VIPeeps. And I post some exclusive videos there that you might like to see as well. So thanks very much for joining me again, and have a super paper crafting day.